President James Monroe is best known for one thing: the Monroe Doctrine. This was where the United States adopted the policy of opposing all new European colonization efforts in the Americas. This was issued in 1823 when the United States wasn't exactly a global power, let alone a nation strong enough to enforce its will in the face of the European powers. Which raises an obvious question. Why did the Europeans generally comply with it? Why didn't they just simply ignore the United States and interfere in the Americas as much as they wanted? So the first 2 decades of the 19th century had seen the start of the Spanish Empire's collapse in South America. Spain did not accept this, and its king, Ferdinand VII, wanted to restore Spanish authority there. At home though, many Spanish citizens wanted him to be less tyrannical and adopt the former Napoleonic liberal constitution. Eventually he did agree to enforce and uphold this constitution, but the issue was that he was lying. As such, civil war and Ferdinand running to the other great powers for help. They were worried about Napoleonic and revolutionary ideals returning, and so they all agreed that France would be allowed to intervene. It did, and Ferdinand was restored as an absolute monarch, and his eyes then turned to the Americas. The Americans were much happier dealing with the new nations in Central or South America because they were mostly all republics. And, in this new state of affairs, the US was mostly the top dog. The British approached Monroe and asked if he would be willing to cooperate in keeping Spain and France out of the New World. However, the Americans refused to cooperate because of 9 years prior. Instead, Monroe unilaterally declared that European powers could no longer try to crush rebelling colonies or try to expand in the Americas if it threatened American interests. The problem was that the US didn't really have a large enough navy or army to enforce this. So why did Europeans listen? Well, it was mostly because Britain agreed with this policy and so used its navy to enforce a similar one. It wanted the Spanish Empire gone so that it could trade with all these new South American nations which it previously couldn't. As you'll likely know, the doctrine was ignored at times. Britain seized the Falkland Islands in 1833, and when it, alongside France, blockaded Argentina in the 1840s to stop its intervention in the Uruguayan Civil War, the Americans did nothing. Furthermore, the doctrine did nothing about the slow and gradual expansion of Russia into Alaska, and America's lack of action damaged relations with its southern neighbours. But its reasoning was that none of this harmed US interests, and also what could it have done anyway? As the century progressed, US power grew, and with it, its navy. And when the US Civil War erupted, some saw an opportunity. Spain retook this territory, although it wouldn't last, and France notably invaded Mexico. Of course, the Americans weren't happy with this, but they were a bit busy. However, once the war was over, the Americans made it clear that if France didn't make plans to leave soon, the US would make war. And unlike in 1823, the US Navy and Army were more than capable of making life extremely difficult for European militaries. This trend continued, and in 1895, when Britain and Venezuela were arguing over who owned this land, the US declared that it would arbitrate. In a genius move, the Americans then gave the British everything they wanted, meaning that if they accepted the land, it would also mean their acceptance of the Monroe Doctrine's legitimacy. The scope of the doctrine soon grew to preventing any European intervention in the Americas in territory that they didn't already own. And by the early 20th century, the United States was far too great a power for the Europeans to do anything about it. And so, obey the Monroe Doctrine they did. I hope you enjoyed this episode with a special thanks to my patrons: James Bisonet, Sky Chappelle, Kartuitska, Yuduan Wang, Wyan Hockey, Anthony Beckett's Blue Cardinal, Alex Schwinn, Aya Firefly, Spencer Lightfoot, Captain Psydog, The McWhopper, The Flying Deutschland, Gustav Swan, Robert C. Perkins, Shuenin, Michael Holbert, Castle Bravo, Marvin Cassow, Winston Kaywood, Rod D. Martin, Spinning 3 Plates, Andy McGeehee, Kamoon Yoon, Danny Atanasio, Mirza Ahmed, Copper Tone, Maggie Patskowski, H.E. from Starvharv, Arthur Hosey Jr., Kalitro, Remco Heusman, Jim Strumberg, Bet Cabot, Charles I, and Lord Beak.